What's up, you lovely people, and welcome back. Today we're talking camera basics part 2. I've been meaning to make another video in this series since I made the last one, linked up here. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. So today we're talking all things camera basics. But first, let's roll the intro. Alright, so before we get started, make sure you hit that subscribe button. It really helps me and the channel out a great deal. And enable that bell as well so that you get notified when I post any new videos. Alright, today we're talking all about white balance, histograms, focus modes, and focus assist tools. So keep in mind, most of what I'll be explaining today applies to video work, but it also crosses over and applies to photographers. As cinematographers or photographers or even directors, exposure and white balance is one of the things that you'll want to know all about or risk possibly ruining your shot. First up, let's talk about white balance. Essentially, white balance is letting your camera know what it can consider as pure white in a shot. There are a couple of rules that you should know, but obviously it'll be up to you after that to make the creative choices for your shot and for your film. Generally, your white balance settings will be identified as a number or degrees in Kelvin. Now, if you go to your camera's white balance settings, which is usually identified by a letter K, you'll be able to either choose from a bunch of pre-programmed scenes or be able to manually enter your degrees Kelvin manually. Now, this value will largely depend on the types of scenes that you're shooting, but will typically range anywhere in value from 1500 Kelvin for something like warm candlelight or fire, all the way to 8000 Kelvin for something like blue hour or bright blue skies. Now, let's say you have a scene that's lit primarily by tungsten lights or candlelight. You may want to set your value somewhere from 2500 to 3200 so that the light that's hitting your actors appears as white. If we take that same setup and set our Kelvin to something like 5600 Kelvin, then those tungsten and candle lights will appear much more orange in the shot. So let's say we're shooting outside on a sunny day or an interior with a lot of daylight flooding in. Typically, daylight or sunlight is more bluish in tone. So we may want to set our white balance or Kelvin to something like 5600 so that way the scene appears more balanced and adjust for those blue tones that are coming in. That light will then appear to be white. Now, if we decide to shoot that same scene at something like 3200 Kelvin, we may start to get a lot of blue tones coming into the image because, like I said, daylight usually tends to be more bluish in nature. Now, of course, there are always exceptions to the rules, but it's always good to learn those rules so that you know how and when to break them. For example, let's say we're trying to film a scene that involves a lot of moonlight coming in. Typically, moonlight will appear more bluish. So we may want to shoot at a lower Kelvin, maybe something around 3200 to 4000 Kelvin. So that way that light that's coming in, if it's 5600 balance, will appear more bluish. Another way to achieve that, for example, would be to put blue gels over your light. Now, one thing is if you're shooting raw in photography or videography, the thing is you can always adjust your white balance later in post. However, it's still something that should be nailed in camera and you should pay close attention to it. One reason is because you want to avoid color casts in your image. Second of all, we all know that in post-production, time can get very expensive. So the more you match and get your shots right in camera, the less time you're spending in post trying to fix and color match every single one of your shots. Not to mention that whenever you pull off your effects and match the shots in camera to begin with, the better your shots will look from the beginning. You definitely don't want to be in a position where you're leaving everything to be fixed in post. That's definitely not professional, and also you can run the risk of maybe ruining some of your shots. Alright, so moving on to exposure and histograms. Exposure is probably one of the things that took me the longest to learn, but I can tell you that nailing it usually is a combination of both practice and experimentation to see what works best. One tool that we'll always have in our arsenal to be able to properly judge exposure, however, especially on cameras, is the histogram. Now, if we look at our histogram, we have low or dark values falling on the left side and high or bright values falling on the right side. Now, if you have an image that's exposed to the left, that may mean that you have a lot of shadows in your image. And if we go all the way to the left, we can hit pure black. Now, at that point, that means that whatever part of the image is in that deep shadow black part, the details can be lost in that section and it'll be either hard or impossible to recover even in post. Now, most of the times in a well-lit image, you'll want to make sure that you're exposed to the right, which means that your midtones have enough brightness and detail in order to be able to properly adjust your image in post. What you want to do also is avoid hitting the very peak or the top of the histogram. That means that your image is likely overexposed, and just like when we were hitting pure black, the pure white means that the detail in that section of your image can also be lost because it's overexposed and the only thing the sensor is picking up is pure white. Now, most of the time our exposure problems can be fixed by messing around with both ISO and aperture settings. Closing down the aperture will allow less light in, and also lowering the ISO can make the sensor less sensitive to light, which will also darken the image. Another way of fixing this is adding something called a neutral density filter to your lens or to a matte box that you have. That lets in less light as well, which can allow you to properly expose for bright scenes. One thing that I've learned through all of my experience is that it's a lot easier to take out light or bring light down, especially in post, but it's a lot harder to try to bring up and get the detail back in your shadows. Even if you manage to recover important details in the shadows that you're looking to show in the frame, chances are that's going to come at a sacrifice in the form of more noise overall in your image and more unpleasant things like color noise coming from your digital sensor. Now, we also have other tools to help us with our exposure, including zebra lines and false color. Zebra lines, which you can usually assign to a particular exposure, will generally show up as moving lines across sections of your image that are overexposed. And you may want to adjust your settings in order to get that detail back in the highlights. False color essentially does the same thing to help you gauge your exposure, but instead of lines, it'll assign color bands to different brightness levels in order to help you determine what part of the scene may be too dark or what part of the scene may be too bright. It also helps because generally you can expose your skin tones to the same values to make sure that the brightness level is there to get the details in your tablet. Finally, let's talk about focus modes and focus assist tools. Now, if you're working in photography, autofocus is definitely one of the main ways to go. Autofocus has become so much better and so reliable, especially with each new generation of camera that's coming out, that nowadays, especially when you're moving fast, autofocus is definitely very valuable to have. Autofocus can also be very valuable to have when you're either filming yourself and you have no one operating your camera, or you're doing things like vlogs where you can't adjust your focus on the go reliably. Now, if you're shooting something like a landscape or a model that's not moving around too much, one-shot autofocus is probably the way to go. What you'll do is you'll set your camera to one-shot autofocus, you'll hold up your camera, half press the shutter button, you'll hear that little beeping sound, and then as soon as you press the shutter, it'll take the picture with your autofocus locked in the one particular spot you were pointing at. If you're shooting your subjects in motion, for example, you can switch over to your camera's version of continuous or servo autofocus, which will track your subject through the shot. This can be really good, for example, if you have children or pets running through the frame that you need to track all the way through. They may not stand still or be in the same spot when you fire off each one of your pictures, so you'll want to make sure you're on continuous autofocus so that it continues to track them and they remain in focus as you're taking pictures. It tends to get a little bit more tricky for video work because almost all of high-end content is done with manual focus. Usually you can switch to manual focus by either going into your camera settings and turning on manual focus, or if you're using something like a photography lens, you can look for the little switch on your lens and turn it from autofocus to manual focus. Now, higher end cinema cameras don't even have the option for autofocus. There have been some lately that have been adding it in, but it's either limited or not exactly what you would find, for example, on a DSLR. Now, since you're already doing so much as a camera operator or a cinematographer on a film shoot, you'll want to be able to focus on other things like nailing composition or making sure you get your shot, that you'll probably want to have somebody else doing the focus pulling for you. To that end, you'll probably have someone like a first AC or a first assistant camera that will be pulling focus for you, either with something like an attached rig or a wireless follow focus rig that can help them pull focus from a distance. Now, there are various tools to assist with focus pulling, especially at the higher end, but on most cameras, you'll have something called focus peaking. This setting will highlight what is in your plane of focus or what's in focus, with usually a red highlight around the subject that moves back and forth as you rack focus. This way, as you're racking focus, you'll be able to tell exactly what part of your image is in focus. Well, that's it for Camera Basics Part 2. If there's something that you want to learn, especially if you're just starting out, drop a comment down below and let me know what that is. I can always add more content to a Camera Basics Part 3. Like I said earlier, it's always good to know the rules so that you know when to use them and when to break them, but it's important to have the knowledge starting out just so you can do the right thing initially. If you know how to use the rules and when to break them, it'll be much easier for you to be able to tell how to set up your shot to get your desired result. As always, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe and the like button on your way out. Share this video with someone, and until next time, go out and create la da da da.
It's the only way we know how to do it.